The largest single component of modern European ancestry did not originate in Europe. It came from a people called the Yamnaya, herders from the grasslands of what is now Russia and Ukraine, who had never seen a forest, who measured wealth in cattle, and who buried their dead alone under earthen mounds on a flat horizon that stretched in every direction further than any European landscape standing today. Most people have never heard of them. And yet the Yamnaya and their descendants are the dominant genetic layer in the modern European genome, larger than the hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe for 40,000 years, larger than the farmers who cleared the forests and raised the megalithic monuments. They arrived less than 5,000 years ago. Within a few centuries of arriving, they had reshaped the genetic landscape of an entire continent. This is their story. They stand on the Pontic-Caspian steppe around 3,500 BCE, and there is almost nothing to interrupt the view. Grass in every direction, feather grass and fescue bending in a wind that carries no smell of wood smoke or turned earth, broken only by the wide, slow valleys of the Dnieper and the Don cutting southward toward the Black Sea. No forest to speak of, no walls, no fixed points that tell you where one community ends and another begins. What there is, stretching in every direction further than a day's riding can reach, is space, and the grass that fills it feeds everything that matters. The landscape covers nearly 1 million square kilometers, from the lower Danube in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east, from the northern shore of the Black Sea up into the forest steppe, where the grassland thins into birch and pine. On a modern map, it looks peripheral, the edge of Europe shading into the edge of Asia. On the ground, in 3,500 BCE, it is one of the most strategically powerful landscapes on Earth, because the grass feeds herds, and the herds feed people, and the people who have learned to move with those herds across this vastness have access to a resource base that the settled farming communities to their west, with their fixed fields and their stone monuments, cannot approach in terms of range, mobility, or the particular kind of freedom that comes from owing your survival to animals rather than to a piece of ground. The people who live here at this moment are the predecessors of the Yamnaya, the culture that will coalesce fully around 3,300 BCE, and whose name archaeologists give them from a Russian word meaning pit, after the burial tradition that defines them. Thus, their ancestry is a mixture of two populations that came together on the eastern steppe, roughly 2,000 years before the culture itself fully forms. Eastern European hunter-gatherers, people whose roots reach deep into the forests and river valleys of Russia, merged with hunter-gatherers whose ancestry traces to the Caucasus and northern Iran. Each contributed roughly half. The result is a population unlike anything to their west, carrying a genome that no population in Europe proper has ever possessed. A man moving through this landscape in 3,500 BCE is tall, taller than the Neolithic farmers living in the river valleys of Central Europe, taller than the hunter-gatherers whose forests once covered the continent. The steppe ancestry selects hard for height, and the skeletal evidence from kurgan burials across the region confirms it. These are large, then physically robust people whose bones carry the density of lives lived outdoors, in demanding conditions, eating well. He has brown eyes, brown hair, skin that is intermediate in tone, lighter than the Western hunter-gatherers of Western Europe, darker than the modern Northern European complexion that his descendants will eventually help produce. He looks, in his general appearance, like no one category the modern world has a ready name for. His wealth is on the hoof, and cattle above all, the foundation of the diet, the measure of status, the reason the seasonal movement across the steppe makes sense. A man with a large herd is a man of substance. A man with a small herd is vulnerable. The entire social world of this culture is organized around the accumulation and protection of animals and every other aspect of life. The alliances made through marriage, the disputes settled between groups, and the decisions about where to winter and where to graze in summer flows from that central fact. Sheep and goats supplement the cattle. Horses are increasingly present, managed, ridden to some degree, their role evolving from prey animal to working partner across the generations of this period. The exact timeline of when horses become routinely ridden rather than simply herded is still debated. But the skeletal damage recorded in Yamnaya burials, the particular wear patterns on femurs and vertebrae that develop across years of repeated stress in a saddle, indicates that men here are spending meaningful time on horseback. Not yet the mounted warriors of later steppe cultures, but riders managing herds across distances that a walker could not cover in the same time, ranging further and knowing more of the landscape than any foot-mobile herder could. The wagon changes everything about the scale of what this life is capable of. Four-wheeled, ox-drawn, its solid wooden wheels heavy and slow. A wagon covers 10 to 15 miles a day on flat ground, less on broken terrain. Speed is not the point. What a wagon carries is the point. The felt tent, the food stores, the children too young to walk the distance, the tools and the equipment of an entire family's life. Before wagons, mobility required choosing between your possessions and your range. With wagons, the choice disappears. The steppe, which once demanded that people travel light and live lean, becomes a landscape that entire family groups can cross with everything they own. He eats meat and dairy. Protein analysis of dental calculus from Yamnaya graves confirms an economy built almost entirely on animal products: fresh meat, dried meat, milk, and fermented milk, the blood of animals in lean times. There is almost no cultivated grain in their diet, yet their teeth are strong for it. The dental decay that grain-heavy diets produce is largely absent from Yamnaya skulls, the contrast with contemporary European farming populations visible in every comparative study. These are well-nourished people, large and robust and fed in ways that the fixed-field farmers to their west, eating their porridge through the cold months, are not. Lactase persistence is spreading through this population at exactly this moment. Thus, the ability to digest fresh milk into adulthood, a mutation that most humans lack, is a significant advantage in a world where your food supply depends on dairy animals. A herd that feeds you through its milk is worth more, in a hard year, than a herd you can only eat. The Yamnaya are carrying this mutation at higher rates than any contemporary farming population. Yes, and they will carry it westward as one of the most consequential genetic legacies of the entire migration, more consequential for daily life across much of Europe, in some ways, than any of the traits the eye can see. When a man of importance dies, he is buried as himself, not dissolved into the collective ancestry of a communal tomb, not placed alongside the mingled bones of generations of strangers joined by shared lineage, but alone, now in a pit, cut into the earth beneath an earthen mound that will rise above the flat steppe and be visible for miles in every direction. The mound is called a kurgan, and the Yamnaya world is covered in them. Thousands of individual mounds stretching across the Ukrainian and Russian steppe, still visible from the air today, each one the permanent marker of a person who was considered significant enough to be remembered in this way. The dead here are individuals, commemorated as individuals, their identity not absorbed into anything larger. The kurgans serve as territory as much as graves. Groups of them line the seasonal routes between winter pasture and summer grazing, following the logic of a landscape where there are no fixed borders and no permanent settlements to anchor a claim. A line of kurgans says what a fence would say in a later world. These routes belong to the people whose dead are buried here. The mounds hold the ground after the living have moved on, marking the paths that a community has used for long enough that their ancestors are embedded in the earth beside them. In his mouth is a language that no one alive has heard, Proto-Indo-European, or something very close to it. It has no writing. It left no direct record. But the evidence of what it became is everywhere. In Welsh and Irish and Scots Gaelic, in English and German and Dutch, in French and Spanish and Italian, in Hindi and Persian and Bengali. The vast majority of languages spoken across Europe today, and a significant portion of those spoken across Asia, are the daughters and granddaughters of the language these people were speaking on the Pontic steppe in the 4th millennium BCE. They did not know they were founding a linguistic dynasty. They were simply talking to their children, to their cattle, to each other across the flat ground between the kurgans, in the only way they knew how. Around 3000 BCE, something shifts. Whether it is climate pressure driving populations outward, internal growth reaching the carrying capacity of the steppe, or simply the pastoral logic of mobile herding following its own momentum toward new ground, the Yamnaya and their descendants begin moving. And not as a single coordinated migration. Nothing this large and this sustained is ever that simple. But as the accumulated pressure of generations of families following their animals into territory that the fixed settlements to the west have never had the mobility to claim. The genetic signal that tracks this movement is one of the most dramatic in the ancient DNA record anywhere on Earth. It is about to appear in places it has never been before, and carried by people who have never seen a forest and are walking into one. The steppe is beginning to empty outward. The world it is emptying into will not look the same again. A man on foot covers 20 to 25 miles in a day across open steppe ground. A good pace, sustainable, the kind of distance a fit person can hold across a full day of walking. A man on horseback covers 2 to 3 times that distance, with less physical cost and more left in reserve when the sun goes down. That gap in range, in speed, in what becomes possible and what becomes reachable, reshapes everything about how a population can organize itself and project itself across a landscape. It is not a small advantage. On the Pontic steppe in the 4th millennium BCE, it is the difference between a world of bounded pasture and a world without effective limits. The horse in this period is not the animal that later centuries will produce. It is compact and stocky, closer in build to the wild Przewalski horses that still exist today than to the tall, refined breeds of later antiquity. Its temperament is difficult, more anxious, more prone to bolt, less tolerant of restraint than the DOM2 lineage that will eventually replace it, and that carries specifically selected traits for docility and a stronger back. Riding one of these animals without stirrups, an invention still 2,000 years away, requires core strength and balance that most people today would find demanding at sustained pace. These are not comfortable animals. They are powerful ones, and the men who ride them have spent their lives learning how. A rider is moving across the steppe at first light, checking where the herd drifted overnight. The cattle have been moving with the wind, as cattle do, and they have crossed into ground that edges toward another group's seasonal range. He finds them before the situation becomes a problem, turns them back, reads the state of the grass ahead, and is back at the camp before the rest of the band has finished breaking their night's fast. On foot, that same task would have taken most of the day. On horseback, it takes until mid-morning. The difference accumulates across every day of the herding season, across every year of a man's working life. It makes him better at the work than anyone on foot can be. The horses being ridden at this moment are not yet the modern domestic lineage. That lineage, DOM2, carrying the selected traits for reduced anxiety and resilience, emerges from the lower Don Volga region in the later 3rd millennium BCE, after the main Yamnaya expansion into Europe has already begun. The men riding into the Balkans and the Danube Valley around 3000 BCE are doing so on animals that have been domesticated for a few generations at most, Animals still carrying the high-strung temperament of their wild ancestors, animals that require skill and experience and a particular kind of nerve to manage. They are riding anyway. The skeletal evidence from their own bones, the wear on the femurs, the degradation of the lower vertebrae, the hip socket changes that develop across years of repeated mounted movement, is written into every burial site where their remains have been examined. The wagon matters as much as the horse, and possibly more for the migration that follows. Four-wheeled, ox-drawn, its wheels solid discs of wood cut from the cross-section of a large trunk. Heavy, slow, incapable of the speed or the range that a rider can achieve. An ox-drawn wagon on flat steppe ground covers perhaps 10 to 15 miles in a day, less on broken terrain, less still in wet conditions. Speed is not the point. What a wagon carries is the point. Before wagons, a mobile herding family on the steppe faces a permanent constraint. Everything they own must either be carried on their backs or loaded onto animals. That means choosing every time they move between the things they need and the distance they can cover. Tools, food stores, and tent materials, children too young to walk the full distance, elderly members of the band who cannot keep pace. All of them impose a limit on range. The wagon removes that limit. Load the felt tent and the food stores, and the children and the equipment onto the wagon, let the ox pull it, and the family can move as far as the land requires without abandoning anything that matters. The combination of wagon mobility and horse management creates something that neither technology produces alone. The wagon extends the range of what a family can carry. The horse extends the range of what a man can see and know and manage across a given day. Together, they produce a demographic engine. Larger herds possible because the range is larger. Larger herds meaning more food and more surplus. More surplus meaning more children surviving to adulthood. More people needing more ground. The frontier of the known world expanding with every generation that grows up knowing both technologies as ordinary facts of life. The farming communities to the west, in the river valleys of Central Europe and the Atlantic coast, have neither. They have oxen for traction, used for plowing fields rather than pulling wagons across open ground. They have no horses at all. Their world is organized around the pace of a person on foot, the range of a day's walking, in the distances that a settled community needs to cover to work its fields and visit its neighbors. What the steppe people approaching from the east are bringing is not just a different ancestry. It is a different relationship with distance, a different sense of what is reachable, what is manageable, what the boundaries of a community's world actually are. A man in a Neolithic farming village on the Danube in 3100 BCE, yet watching a group of steppe people approach across the flat ground to the east, is seeing something his entire cultural experience has no framework for. Not just the horses, though the horses alone are unlike anything the farming world has encountered in this role, but the whole configuration, the riders and the wagons and the cattle and the felt tents, and the way these people move as though the ground has no edges, as though the horizon is not a limit but a direction. It is a world organized on entirely different principles from anything the farming village represents, and it is coming toward him at a pace he cannot match on foot. The expansion that follows is not solely the product of this technological advantage. The genetics, the disease exposure, the demographic pressure of a population producing more children than the land they are leaving can support. All of these are also part of what drives the Yamnaya and their descendants westward. But the horse and the wagon are what make the scale of the expansion possible. They are what allow a population from the lower Volga to reach the Atlantic coast within 1,000 years. They are what turn the steppe world's particular combination of mobility and surplus into one of the most consequential demographic events in the history of the continent it is about to enter. The first sign that something is changing in the forest villages of Central Europe is not a sound or a sight. It is a burial. A man interred not in the collective long barrow where his community's ancestors have been placed for generations, their bones mixed and rearranged across decades, the individual dissolved into the shared ancestry of the group, but alone in a pit, under a low mound of his own, on his side with his knees drawn up, a stone battle axe beside his hand, and a cord-decorated pot near his head. He is the only person in this grave. The mound above him belongs to no one else. Now something has arrived in this landscape that did not exist here before, and it has brought with it an entirely different idea of what a person is and what death means. The culture that carries this burial tradition westward across Europe from around 3000 BCE is known as the corded ware, named for the distinctive decoration pressed into its pottery by rolling a twisted cord across the wet clay before firing. Thus, the pots are recognizable anywhere across the enormous arc the culture eventually covers, from the Rhine in the west to the Volga in the east, from Denmark in the north to the Alpine forelands in the south. The same individual burial, the same cord-impressed ceramics, the same stone battle axes appearing in grave after grave across a sweep of territory larger than modern Western Europe. It is one of the most geographically extensive cultural phenomena in prehistoric Europe, and it moves fast. And the people carrying it carry something else as well, a genome that the farming populations of Central and Northern Europe have never encountered. Their ancestry runs roughly 75% Yamnaya-like. The steppe herder signal, Eastern European hunter-gatherer, and Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry combined, unlike anything in the gene pools of the Neolithic world to their west. They are not Yamnaya in a direct patrilineal sense. The Y chromosome lineages tell a more complicated story, in suggesting they descended from a related but distinct northeastern steppe population rather than from the Yamnaya burial mounds specifically. But the ancestry is unmistakably of the same broad origin, and it arrives in Central Europe with a demographic weight that the existing populations cannot absorb without being transformed. The expansion moves into a continent that has already been weakened. The farming populations of Northern Europe in the late 3rd millennium BCE are not at their peak. Pollen records and site distribution data show declining agricultural activity in the centuries before the corded ware arrival. Fewer occupied sites, smaller communities, evidence of the kind of contraction that precedes a population under stress. Plague is part of the story. The bacterium responsible for it has been recovered from steppe-associated individuals of this period, and if disease moved ahead of the migration itself, carried through the trade contacts and frontier encounters that always precede full population movement, the Neolithic communities of Northern Europe may have arrived at the moment of first sustained contact already reduced in numbers and in resilience. The genetic signal of what follows is stark. In regions of Northern Europe where the ancient DNA record is richest, Poland, Germany, Scandinavia, and the Baltic, the steppe ancestry rises from near zero to majority within the span of a few generations. Communities that show no steppe signal whatsoever in one generation show 70% or more in their grandchildren's graves. The Neolithic farming ancestry, the genome that the Anatolian farmers carried into Europe 4,000 years earlier, so that built the megalithic tradition and cleared the forests and raised the stone circles, disappears from the Northern European record with a thoroughness that rivals, in some regions exceeds, the replacement of the hunter-gatherers by the farmers before them. The migration is male-skewed. The pattern in the ancient DNA is consistent across multiple regions and multiple studies. Men carrying steppe Y chromosome lineages, haplogroup R1A above all, The marker that becomes dominant across the corded Ware world. Arriving in farming communities, fathering children with local women, the male lineages of the previous population disappearing from the record within a few generations. What this means in the lives of actual people is not something the bones resolve. Whether it reflects violence or the social dynamics of a pastoral world where men accumulate status and attract partners from outside their own group, or something more coercive than either of those framings allows, the record does not say. What it says is that the male line of the Neolithic farming world was largely replaced, and replaced fast. The corded Ware man burying his dead differently from everyone around him is doing more than changing a funeral custom. He is expressing a set of values about individual identity, personal achievement, and the meaning of a single life that the collective burial tradition cannot accommodate. The long barrow says, "You belong to your ancestors, and your bones will mingle with theirs, and the group persists beyond you." The individual kurgan-style grave says, "You were yourself, and your death marks the end of your particular existence, and the objects beside you in the ground are yours and not shared with anyone." These are not equivalent ideas wearing different clothes. They are genuinely different ways of understanding what a person is, expressed in the most deliberate act a society performs. By around 2600 BCE, the corded Ware burial tradition has been adopted across an enormous area of northern and central Europe. The radiocarbon dates from hundreds of burial sites, showing a rapid, near-simultaneous consolidation of the practice across regions separated by hundreds of kilometers. This is the moment when what began as the advance of a specific migrating population becomes something broader, a set of values and practices adopted by populations across the continent, spreading through the social networks of a connected prehistoric world at a speed that only makes sense if the ideas themselves carry power, not just the people who first expressed them. In Scandinavia, the corded Ware expansion encounters the pitted Ware culture. Hunter-gatherers who have been living along the Baltic coast for centuries alongside the farming populations of the interior, fishing and hunting seal, maintaining their own way of life at the margins of the agricultural world. The ancient DNA from this period in Scandinavia tells a complicated story. The farming populations of the Scandinavian interior are largely replaced by steppe ancestry, yes, but the coastal pitted Ware people persist for another several centuries, contributing their Western hunter-gatherer genetic signal to the populations that eventually form around them. The steppe expansion in Scandinavia is not a simple replacement. It moves through the interior while the coast holds, for a time, to its older ways. A man living in what is now central Germany around 2700 BCE is burying his father in a pit grave under a low mound at the edge of the cleared ground. He places the stone axe his father carried beside his right hand, the hand that used it. He places a cord-decorated pot near his head. He fills in the grave and mounds the earth above it and leaves his father there alone, under his own mound, marked as himself. The farming villages that surrounded this place a generation ago are emptier than they were, their ancestral long barrows still visible on the ridgeline above, but no longer the center of anything living. Where the world his father was born into and the world he is living in are not the same world. They are separated by one of the most consequential demographic shifts in the history of the continent. He does not know this. He knows his father's name and the weight of the stone axe and the particular quality of the clay he shaped the pot from. He buries his father and walks back to the settlement, and the mound behind him will still be there 5,000 years later. The corded Ware expansion is not the end of the movement. It is the first wave. The second wave, the Bell Beaker expansion, is already forming in the contact zones to the west, where the steppe ancestry mixing with local farming and hunter-gatherer populations is producing a new population that will carry the steppe genetic legacy further into Western Europe, into Iberia, into the Atlantic fringe, and eventually across the water to Britain. The continent's transformation is not yet complete, but the shape it will eventually take, the distribution of steppe ancestry across modern Europe, highest in the north and west, lower in the south, is being set in these centuries, one burial at a time, one mound at a time, from the Rhine to the Volga and back again. The Neolithic world is ending. Not all at once. In the south, it will persist for longer, the farmer ancestry holding in populations that the steppe migrations reached later and less completely. But in the north, and the transformation is already nearly total. The people who built the long barrows are gone, or reduced to a trace, or absorbed into a world that no longer speaks their language or buries its dead the way they did. What comes next is the Bell Beaker expansion, and after that the Bronze Age, and after that the continent we recognize. The steppe has emptied outward, and Europe will never look the same again. The man in the pit grave under his low mound was the future. He just didn't know it yet. Neither did the people whose world he was replacing. The pottery appears in Iberia before the people do. Bell-shaped drinking vessels, reddish, decorated with horizontal bands of geometric ornament, distinctive enough that any traveler who has seen one can recognize another, are being made and used in the Iberian Peninsula from around 2750 BCE, among populations that carry no steppe ancestry whatsoever. The farmers and herders of Copper Age Iberia have adopted the style, the shape, the decoration, the social context of drinking from a particular kind of cup, without acquiring the people who will eventually carry the genetic transformation. The Bell Beaker is a cultural object first. The migration comes later, from a different direction entirely. It comes from Central Europe, moving westward and southward along the river valleys and mountain passes of a continent that the corded Ware expansion has already begun to transform. By around 2500 BCE, the Bell Beaker phenomenon has fully coalesced. A culture attached to people with substantial steppe ancestry spreading outward from Central Europe toward the Atlantic and the Mediterranean fringes. A man carrying a copper dagger and a cord-decorated drinking cup, burying his dead in individual pit graves, speaking a language whose roots run back to the Pontic steppe. He is now appearing in regions that have never held anyone like him. In what is now the Paris Basin, a family is watching something arrive that has no precedent in their experience. The community they belong to is late Neolithic, descendants of the Anatolian farmers who cleared these valleys 4,000 years ago, their bones carrying the distinctive genetic signal of the farming expansion, their world organized around the ancestral claim expressed in collective burial and communal monument. The man who arrives among them carries steppe ancestry at levels above 70%. He is from a different world entirely, and the child born between his lineage and theirs will carry both in roughly equal measure. The science advances study that recovered this family's bones, a collective burial from around 2500 BCE in the Paris Basin, caught the admixture happening in real time, one generation's worth of mixing preserved in the ground. France absorbs the Bell Beaker expansion differently from Britain. With the steppe ancestry in Bell Beaker individuals from northern France runs between 50 and 68%, high, comparable to the British and Dutch Bell Beaker populations. In southern France, the same individuals show only 28 to 40% steppe ancestry. The Neolithic farming world of the Mediterranean South holding its ground more firmly, the admixture less complete, the replacement less thorough. And some individuals buried with Bell Beaker grave goods in the Alsace region carry no steppe ancestry at all. The culture spreads faster than the genes in some places, adopted by local populations as a prestige package before the people who originated it arrive in sufficient numbers to transform the gene pool. The Iberian transformation is among the most striking anywhere on the continent, precisely because of the gap between the pottery and the people. The early Iberian bell beakers, the groups who first adopted the cup and the burial style from their own local tradition, are genetically identical to the Copper Age Iberian farmers who preceded them. No steppe ancestry, none at all. Then, between 2500 and 2000 BCE, the picture changes completely. Steppe ancestry bell beaker people arrived from Central Europe, moving southward through the Pyrenees and along the Atlantic coast. And within 5 centuries, they have replaced 40% of Iberia's total ancestry. The Y chromosome story is sharper still. The male lineages common in Copper Age Iberia, haplogroups I2, G2, and H, are almost completely replaced by R1b-M269, the lineage carried by the incoming Central European bell beaker men. Nearly 100% of Iberia's Y chromosomes within 5 centuries. The pottery arrived peacefully. The people did not leave the same footprint. A woman in a Bronze Age tomb at Castillejo del Bonete in south-central Spain captures the texture of what this mixing looked like at the individual level. Her genome places her ancestry entirely within the Copper Age Iberian tradition, the Anatolian farmer inheritance. No steppe ancestry. The man buried alongside her carries full steppe-derived bell beaker ancestry. They are buried together, their lives apparently intertwined, their genomes reflecting 2 worlds that were, in the period of their lives, meeting and merging across the length of the peninsula. Their children, if they had them, would have carried both. In the wetlands of the Rhine-Meuse Delta, the waterlogged lowlands of what is now the Netherlands, Belgium, and Western Germany, something unusual has been happening for thousands of years. While the rest of Europe was experiencing successive waves of demographic replacement, the hunter-gatherer ancestry that characterized the original European population persisted here at roughly 50%, 3,000 years longer than almost anywhere else. The wet, low-lying ground was too difficult for intensive farming, too marginal for the grain agriculture that drove the Neolithic expansion, and so the people who lived in it had absorbed some farmer ancestry through contact without ever being replaced. When the corded Ware expansion reached the lowland Netherlands, even this was anomalous. Corded Ware pottery appeared without the steppe ancestry that accompanied it everywhere else. The style adopted culturally while the gene pool remained locally rooted. It is from this peculiar population, high in hunter-gatherer ancestry, shaped by 3,000 years of surviving at the margins of every wave that swept through Europe, that the bell beaker people who crossed to Britain were drawn. As the February 2026 Nature study confirmed it precisely. The Rhine-Meuse bell beaker population, carrying roughly 80 to 85% steppe-derived corded Ware ancestry alongside the distinctive hunter-gatherer signal of the lowland delta, is the closest genetic match for the people who arrived on the British coast around 2400 BCE. The ancient hunter-gatherers of the Rhine Delta, persisting against all odds for millennia, thus contributed their particular legacy to the most consequential migration in British prehistoric history. Italy sees a different pattern again. The bell beaker material culture arrives in the Po Valley in Tuscany around 2500 to 2200 BCE, absorbed selectively into the existing Remodello and Rinaldone cultural traditions rather than replacing them. Bell beaker grave goods appear alongside local pottery styles, the imported and the indigenous coexisting in the same sites without one overwhelming the other. The genetic transformation in Italy is real, but more gradual than in Iberia or northern France. steppe ancestry entering the peninsula over centuries of contact rather than in a rapid demographic surge. The Mediterranean south, buffered by geography and distance from the Central European core of the Bell-Beaker expansion, absorbs the new ancestry on its own terms and in its own time. By 2000 BCE, the Bell-Beaker expansion is largely complete across Western Europe. From Iberia to France to the Low Countries to Britain, referenced here but fully covered elsewhere, the genetic landscape has been transformed by a second great wave of steppe ancestry following the corded Ware expansion of the previous 5 centuries. Northern and Western Europe now carry the steppe ancestry in the proportions that, give or take the subsequent additions of the Iron Age and later periods, still define the modern genome. The Neolithic farming world is not gone. Its ancestry persists, highest in the Mediterranean south, diluted but present everywhere. But it is no longer dominant in most of the continent. The people who completed the picture have arrived. The mixing that produces the modern European genome is, in its broad outlines, done. The Bell-Beaker cup that a man in Iberia was drinking from in 2700 BCE, made by farmers with no steppe ancestry and a local tradition that had nothing to do with the Pontic grasslands, that same cup 2 centuries later is being held by the descendants of people from the Russian steppe, who have carried it across Central Europe and into the Atlantic fringe and given it meanings its original makers could never have anticipated. Objects travel further and faster than explanations. The genetics eventually catches up. The continent is transformed. The steppe has emptied itself into Europe through 2 great waves separated by 5 centuries. And the Europe that emerges from this period is, in its genetic foundations, the Europe that still exists today. What remains is the sorting, the ongoing mixing and selection that drives the final consolidation of the modern Northern European appearance across the Bronze and Iron Ages. But the ingredients are all present now, when in the populations that cover the continent from the Atlantic coast to the Russian plain. The picture is nearly complete, nearly, not yet. The mixing still has work to do, and the selection pressure on the lightning variants is still running. But the people who will carry that process to its conclusion are already here, already farming and herding and burying their dead in the individual graves that announce, one mound at a time, that the world has changed. The steppe is in Europe now. It will not leave. A Yamnaya man standing on the Pontic steppe around 3000 BCE is taller than almost anyone he will ever encounter. Not by a small margin, by a margin that would be visible and immediate in any meeting between his people and the farming communities to their west. The skeletal evidence from kurgan burials across the steppe region confirms it consistently. Average male height among the Yamnaya ran to around 175 centimeters, placing them among the tallest people anywhere in the ancient world. The farming populations of Neolithic Europe, eating their grain diets through long northern winters, averaged several centimeters shorter. The difference between a Yamnaya herder and a Central European farmer was not subtle. It announced itself the moment they stood in the same space. His hair is dark, brown to black, the same range that the ancient DNA from Yamnaya and corded Ware individuals returns when the pigmentation variants are red. His eyes are brown. These are not surprising traits for a population whose ancestry traces back through Eastern European hunter-gatherers and Caucasus hunter-gatherers, both populations with predominantly dark eyes and hair. The assumption, common in popular accounts of the steppe migrations, should that the Indo-European expansions brought blue eyes and blonde hair into Europe, is wrong in its simplest form. The Yamnaya did not look like the modern Scandinavian. They looked, in their general coloring, closer to a modern Armenian or Georgian. Brown-eyed, dark-haired, the particular combination of features that the Caucasus ancestry gives. His skin is intermediate. Not the deep melanin-rich complexion of the Western hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe for 40,000 years before the farmers arrived. Not the lighter tone of the Anatolian farmers who carried the SLC24A5 skin-lightening variant at high frequency and had been under grain diet selection pressure for thousands of years. Something between the two, moderately light, carrying some of the lightning variants, but not at the frequencies that would produce the pale complexion the modern Northern European stereotype represents. He is lighter than the hunter-gatherers, darker than the modern norm. An intermediate face, on a very tall body moving across the flattest landscape in the ancient European world. He is built for the life he leads. Yet the physical demands of managing large herds across a landscape that rewards mobility and punishes weakness are written into his skeleton. Denser bone, more pronounced muscle attachments, the particular wear patterns that develop in bodies doing sustained physical work from childhood. He is not simply tall. He is tall and robust in a way that the more sedentary farming populations doing repetitive agricultural labor rather than the varied demands of pastoral life do not match. A man of the Yamnaya world at his physical peak is a different kind of physical presence from anything the settled farming world of Central Europe has produced. What he carries is specific. The stone battle axe, the defining object of the Yamnaya and corded Ware burial traditions, is not merely a tool. It is the portable symbol of a social role, the man capable of violence whose status is tied to the capacity to project force and the reputation that comes from having done so. The copper ornaments in some of the richer graves mark access to exchange networks that span the continent. The drinking vessel near his head is not for water. It held fermented dairy or grain drink, consumed at the gatherings where alliances were made and status was publicly performed. These objects are a vocabulary, and the vocabulary says, this was a man who mattered in the particular way that mattered here. His body is not pale in the way that the modern imagination places at the center of European prehistoric identity. This is the fact that most directly challenges the popular picture of the Indo-European migrations. The people who carried the steppe ancestry westward into Europe, who replaced or diluted the Neolithic farming populations across the continent, who left the dominant genetic layer in the modern Northern European genome, were brown-eyed and dark-haired and intermediate in skin tone. Yet they did not bring the pale Northern European appearance to Europe. They brought the genetic material that, mixed with what was already there and subjected to thousands more years of selection pressure, eventually produced it. The height is the most immediately visible contribution of the steppe ancestry to the modern European phenotype. And it is still visible today. The north-south gradient in average European height maps almost perfectly onto the distribution of steppe ancestry across the continent. Northern Europeans' highest steppe ancestry are among the tallest populations in the world. Southern Europeans' lowest steppe ancestry, highest Anatolian farmer ancestry, are consistently shorter on average. The farmers selected against height in some ways, their grain diets producing less of the protein density that the pastoral diet provides. The steppe people selected for it hard, and their descendants carry the signal of that selection in their skeletons 3,000 years later. Lactase persistence travels with the steppe ancestry too, and its spread across Europe is one of the fastest and most dramatic selective sweeps in the ancient DNA record. A man who can drink fresh milk efficiently extracts more nutrition from the same herd than one who cannot. On the steppe, where the margin between a productive season and a hard one is measured in animal condition and milk yield, this difference has been accumulating selective advantage for generations. The Yamnaya carry the mutation at rates no contemporary farming population can match, and as their descendants spread across Europe, marrying into farming communities and herding farming hybrid populations, the variant follows. By the Middle Bronze Age, it is rising sharply across the continent. By the Iron Age, it is common across northern Europe. It is, in purely demographic terms, one of the most successful single genetic changes the ancient world produced. A corded Ware man burying his father in Central Europe around 2700 BCE is taller than the farming men buried in the long barrows on the ridge above him. His eyes are brown. His hair is dark. His skin sits somewhere between the two worlds his ancestry spans. The steppe world his paternal line carries, and the farming world his mother's lineage came from. He is not the pale northern European of the modern imagination. He is the ancestor of that person, one generation in a chain of mixing and selection that will, across another 1,000 years of Bronze Age and Iron Age Europe, produce the complexion and the coloring that the modern world associates with the ancient European past. He does not know what his descendants will look like. He knows the weight of the battle axe beside his father's hand, the smell of the freshly turned earth, the flat gray sky of a Central European autumn pressing down on the kurgan mound he is building. He is simply a man burying his father in the way his world demands, alone, under his own mound, marked as himself. What his blood will eventually produce, across 100 generations of mixing he cannot see, is not something he can know. It is simply what happens next in a story that has been building toward its conclusion for 40,000 years. The appearance of the steppe people is one ingredient in a synthesis. Not the whole of it, not even the most important part of it in terms of the specific pigmentation changes that produce the modern Northern European complexion. The skin lightening came primarily from the farmers. The pale eyes came primarily from the hunter-gatherers. What the steppe people contributed most visibly was height, and the lactase persistence that made their descendants healthier than the populations they mixed with, and the final genetic pieces that, under continued selection pressure across the Bronze and Iron Ages, drove the lightning trajectory to completion. They completed the picture not by bringing the finished product, but by providing the last ingredients, a synthesis that had been building, piece by piece, for thousands of years before they arrived. He is tall, he is dark, he is part of something he cannot see, and he is, in the most literal genetic sense, the ancestor of most people of European descent alive today. By 2000 BCE, the major migrations are over. The corded Ware expansion has swept through northern and central Europe. The bell beaker populations have moved through Western Europe and across the Channel. Yet the three streams of ancestry that will define the modern European genome, hunter-gatherer, Anatolian farmer, and steppe, are present across the continent in every population, in proportions that vary by region, but nowhere reduced to zero. The mixing is underway everywhere simultaneously, and what it is producing, generation by generation, is the genetic landscape that still underlies the modern European world. In what is now northern Germany, a man is herding cattle across cleared ground that his grandfather's grandfather helped open. His genome carries roughly 50% steppe ancestry, corded Ware and bell beaker inheritance, the legacy of the expansion that reshaped this region a few centuries earlier. The remaining half is a mixture of Anatolian farmer ancestry from the Neolithic populations his steppe ancestry forebears mixed with, and a fraction of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry persisting from the oldest layer of European prehistory. He's the product of three worlds that were, as recently as his great-great-grandparents' generation, living on different continents. He does not know this. He knows his cattle and his ground. To his south, in the valleys of what is now Bavaria and Austria, the picture is different. The steppe ancestry here runs lower. The bell beaker and corded Ware expansions reach this region, but mixed with a larger, more established Neolithic farming population that diluted the incoming steppe signal more than in the north. The Anatolian farmer ancestry is proportionally stronger here, the steppe ancestry weaker. A man in a Bronze Age village in the Alpine foothills looks, in his general appearance, somewhat different from his counterpart on the North German plain, darker in coloring, shorter, carrying more of the Mediterranean ancestry that came originally from Anatolia. Both of them are Bronze Age Europeans. They do not look the same. Further south still, the Mycenaean Greeks are building the palace civilizations of the Aegean. The ancient DNA from these populations shows something unexpected. By the Middle Bronze Age, individuals from the northern Greek mainland are carrying roughly 50% steppe ancestry, levels comparable to Bell Beaker populations in Central Europe. The steppe expansion reached further south and earlier than the older archaeological models suggested. The warriors depicted on the Lion Gate at Mycenae, the palace administrators of Tiryns and Pylos, the people whose culture would eventually feed into the Greek world that shaped Western civilization. They carried substantial Pontic steppe ancestry in their genomes, alongside the older Aegean farmer inheritance. The steppe, it turns out, went almost everywhere. In Iberia, in the westernmost corner of Europe, the synthesis is proceeding on its own timeline. The Bell Beaker replacement of Iberian Y chromosomes is complete. The steppe ancestry present across the peninsula at between 30 and 50% in most populations. But the Anatolian farmer ancestry is deeper here than in the north. The Neolithic farming world of Iberia had been established for longer and more thoroughly than almost anywhere else on the Atlantic fringe, and the incoming steppe ancestry mixed with a larger pool of existing ancestry rather than replacing it as completely as it did in northern Europe. The Basque people, and living in the mountain valleys between Spain and France, will eventually become the notable exception, carrying unusually high Neolithic farmer ancestry and unusually low steppe ancestry, their isolation in the mountains partially insulating them from the full weight of the Bronze Age transformation. In the east, across the great plain of what is now Poland and the Baltic states, the picture is different again. Indeed, the Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry, the deep Mesolithic genetic layer of Eastern Europe, distinct from the Western hunter-gatherers of the Atlantic fringe, feeds into the steppe populations themselves and then back into the European populations through the steppe migrations. Populations in what is now Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia carry among the highest proportions of hunter-gatherer ancestry anywhere in modern Europe. Not the Western WHG signal of the Atlantic and Scandinavian populations, but the Eastern EHG signal that the steppe migrations carried westward as part of their own inherited ancestry. The oldest genetic layer in Europe, arriving back into the continent via the longest possible route. What all of these populations share, by 2000 BCE, is the basic structure of the modern European genome. 3 streams, present everywhere in proportions that vary but are nowhere absent. The variation across the continent is not random. It maps almost perfectly onto the geography of the 3 migrations. Highest steppe ancestry, where the corded Ware and Bell Beaker expansions hit hardest. Northern Germany, Scandinavia, the British Isles, Ireland. Highest Anatolian farmer ancestry, where the Neolithic world was most deeply established and the steppe migrations least complete. Sardinia, the southern Iberia, the Greek islands. Highest hunter-gatherer ancestry in the east and north, where the oldest populations persisted longest at the margins. The modern map of European appearance is being drawn in its broad outlines right now in the Bronze Age mixing events of the 2nd millennium BCE. The pigmentation is still sorting itself, and the skin lightening variants are present everywhere, but have not yet reached the frequencies that define the modern Northern European complexion. That process, driven by continued selection pressure in grain farming populations under weak northern sunlight, will continue through the Bronze Age and Iron Age, before approaching its modern levels. The blue-eye variants, common in the hunter-gatherer ancestry that threads through every population, are circulating widely. The blonde hair variants, so carried in the steppe ancestry and amplified in the Scandinavian populations where hunter-gatherer and steppe ancestry mixed in the highest proportions, are rising. The full modern Northern European appearance is not yet common, but all the ingredients are in place, in the right populations, under the right pressures, heading in the direction that will eventually produce it. A Bronze Age community in what is now Denmark is, by this point, carrying all three streams in proportions that make it the closest thing to a modern Northern European population that has yet existed on Earth. Steppe ancestry at 50% or more. Anatolian farmer ancestry diluted but present. Hunter-gatherer ancestry contributing the pale eye variance and its fraction of the overall genome. The children born in this community are lighter in complexion than their great-grandparents. The selection pressure on the lightning variance driving the change generation by generation in ways that no individual life is long enough to observe. In a few hundred years, they will be lighter still. In 1,000 years, the complexion that will define the Northern European stereotype will be well on its way to its modern frequency. This is the synthesis. Not a single moment, not a single event, but the cumulative consequence of three migrations arriving at different times, and mixing in different proportions across a continent-wide landscape, subjected to the selection pressures of diet and latitude and the particular demographic dynamics of a Bronze Age world in which pastoral and farming economies are learning to coexist. The modern Northern European genome did not exist before this period. It assembled itself during this period, and it has been refining itself in the populations that descend from it ever since. The steppe world that produced the Yamnaya still exists, in a sense, in the bones of everyone of Northern European descent. Diluted beyond recognition, mixed into a genome that its original carriers would not recognize, expressed in faces that looked nothing like the dark-haired, brown-eyed herders of the Pontic grassland. But present, measurable, the dominant layer in a synthesis that took 5,000 years to complete. And as the grass of the Pontic steppe bent in the wind in 3,500 BCE and fed the cattle of people who had no idea where their descendants would end up. Their descendants ended up everywhere. Europe, by the end of the second millennium BCE, is recognizably the Europe whose genetic structure underlies the modern world. Not identical to it. There are still migrations to come, still admixture events that will add and shift and refine. But the foundation is laid. The three streams are mixed. And the synthesis is done in its broad outlines, and the continent is beginning, slowly and then less slowly, to look the way it looks today. What it means that this is true, what it says about ancestry, identity, and the deep past of a continent that has spent centuries constructing stories about where its people came from, is the subject of the final video. For now, the facts are enough. 3 peoples, 3 migrations, 1 continent, 1 genome. The picture is complete. The steppe has made Europe. And Europe from this point forward is what it is. The Yamnaya man who herded cattle on the Pontic steppe around 3000 BCE did not know he was the ancestor of most people of European descent alive today. He knew the grass and the animals and the flat horizon and the seasonal routes between the winter pastures and the summer grazing. He knew the weight of a stone battle axe and the smell of fermented milk and the sound of wagon wheels on dry ground. Yet he did not know that the genome he carried westward with his descendants would become, 5,000 years later, the dominant genetic layer in the modern European world. He was simply living and moving and taking everything he had with him wherever he went. What he left behind is measurable. Steppe ancestry, the particular combination of Eastern European and Caucasus hunter-gatherer lineages that the Yamnaya world produced, is present in every modern European population without exception. It peaks in the north and west, in Ireland and Iceland and Scandinavia, where the bell beaker and corded ware expansions hit hardest and the Neolithic farming populations were most thoroughly replaced. Steppe ancestry runs between 40 and 60% of the modern genome. In the south, in Sardinia, in the Greek islands, in parts of Iberia, it runs lower, diluted by the deeper Anatolian farmer ancestry that the Neolithic world left behind. But it is present everywhere, and the steppe reached everywhere. None of the three ancestral streams that built the modern European genome originates in what we now call Europe in its fully formed state. The hunter-gatherers came ultimately from Africa, modern humans dispersing out of the continent where the species evolved, reaching Europe 45,000 years ago via Western Asia. The farmers came from Anatolia, the region of what is now Turkey, now where agriculture first developed in the Fertile Crescent and its adjacent highlands, and from where the farming populations expanded westward beginning around 7,000 years ago. The steppe people came from a contact zone between Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, a population that assembled itself from two hunter-gatherer lineages on the grasslands east of the Carpathians, and that expanded westward into a continent it had never seen. Three populations, none of them European in origin, producing between them the genome that is now called European. The irony is precise, and it is total. The appearance most associated with European identity, the pale skin, the light eyes, the light hair of the Northern European stereotype, is the product of ingredients that came from Africa, from the Middle East, and from the Eurasian steppe. The pale skin came primarily from farmers who walked out of Anatolia. The pale eyes came primarily from hunter-gatherers whose ultimate origin was African. The height came from herders whose ancestry traces to the Caucasus and the Russian grasslands. The blonde hair assembled itself from ancient North Eurasian genetic material carried westward through the steppe ancestry stream. Nothing about the modern Northern European appearance is ancient to Northern Europe. All of it arrived from somewhere else. So the lactase persistence that allows most Northern Europeans to drink fresh milk into adulthood, one of the most widespread and consequential genetic traits in the modern European population, came with the steppe people and spread under intense selection pressure through the Bronze Age populations that descended from them. A man in Viking-age Scandinavia drinking fresh milk from his cattle is expressing a genetic trait that his ancestors acquired on the Pontic steppe 4,000 years before him, carried westward by people whose names and languages are entirely lost, preserved in his body through the selective advantage it gave in every generation between theirs and his. The Indo-European languages, the family that produced Welsh and Irish and English and French and German and Spanish and Italian and Hindi and Persian and Bengali and dozens more, came with the steppe ancestry stream. The Yamnaya and their descendants spoke a language whose daughters cover most of Europe and much of Asia today. They did not know they were founding a linguistic dynasty. They were simply talking in the only language they had, to their children and their cattle and each other across the flat ground of the steppe, and then across the forests and river valleys of a continent that took their words and kept them, changing them beyond recognition over 5,000 years, but never losing the deep structure that marks them all as kin. The world these three populations built together is not something any of them planned or intended or could have imagined. The hunter-gatherer who survived the last glacial maximum in the valleys of southwestern France was not building toward the modern European genome. The Anatolian farmer who cleared the first fields in the Balkans was not building toward it either. The Yamnaya herder, moving his cattle westward from the steppe, had no conception of what his descendants would become or where they would end up. The modern European genome is the unintended product of three separate histories that happen to intersect on the same continent within the same few thousand years, driven by climate and diet and demographic pressure, and the simple logic of people following their animals and their survival into new ground. What the genetics shows, stripped of everything else, is that the category of European ancestry is not ancient. It assembled itself recently, within the last 5,000 years in its current proportions, within the last 3,000 to 4,000 years in anything approaching the modern distribution. The populations that now carry the highest proportions of steppe ancestry, the Irish, the Icelanders, the Scandinavians, are the populations whose deep ancestry was most recently and most thoroughly transformed. The populations that look most characteristically Northern European are the ones whose genetics are, in the deepest sense, the most recently assembled. The steppe man is in all of them, in the Irish farmer and the Swedish fisherman and the German engineer and the Polish teacher and the Spanish architect. In every person of European descent alive today, the ghost of the Pontic grassland is present in the genome, measurable, specific, and traceable to a population that coalesced on the lower Volga and Don somewhere around 3,300 BCE and began moving westward into a world they had never seen and that would never be the same again. He is the ancestor of most of the people alive in Europe today. He did not know this. He was simply a man on a steppe with cattle under a flat sky moving west.